Before Rome became an empire, before Caesar, before Augustus, there was a moment when Rome almost ceased to exist entirely. Not because of a civil war, not because of a plague, because of one man from North Africa who crossed the Alps with war elephants and spent 15 years proving that Rome was not invincible. His name was Hannibal Barca, and this is the story of the civilization that almost stopped Rome before it began.
To understand why Carthage and Rome fought the most brutal series of wars in ancient history, you need to understand what Carthage actually was. Carthage was not a minor city-state. It was the dominant maritime power of the Western Mediterranean, a vast commercial empire stretching across North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 814 BC, Carthage had built its power not through conquest, but through trade. Its navy was the finest in the ancient world. Its wealth was legendary. Rome, by contrast, was a land power, formidable on the ground, but with virtually no naval experience at the start of the 3rd century BC. The two empires collided in 264 BC over a single island, Sicily. What began as a local dispute escalated into the First Punic War, 23 years of brutal fighting on land and sea. Rome had never fought a major naval war before, so it did what Rome always did. It adapted. Roman engineers captured a Carthaginian warship, copied it, and within 60 days had built a fleet of over 100 vessels. They then invented a device called the corvus, a rotating boarding bridge that turned naval combat into land combat, neutralizing Carthage's naval superiority. 23 years later, exhausted and financially broken, Carthage surrendered. It ceded Sicily, then Sardinia and Corsica. It paid massive reparations. The greatest maritime empire in the world had been humbled by a power that hadn't owned a single warship at the start of the conflict. But one man refused to accept that this was the end. His name was Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, and before he died, he made his young son swear an oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Hannibal was 9 years old when he took that oath. He kept it for the rest of his life.
After the First Punic War, Carthage was down, but not destroyed. Hamilcar Barca took what remained of Carthage's military to Spain, where he spent years rebuilding Carthaginian power through conquest and silver mining. When Hamilcar died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal took command, and when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army chose its new commander unanimously. Hannibal Barca was 26 years old. 2 years later, in 219 BC, Hannibal attacked Saguntum, a city in Spain aligned with Rome. Rome declared war. The Second Punic War had begun. What happened next was one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. Hannibal did not wait for Rome to come to him. He went to Rome. Not by sea. Rome controlled the sea. Overland, through Spain, through Gaul, and over the Alps, in winter. He set out with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The Alps in winter killed nearly a third of his army and most of his elephants. Frostbite, avalanches, ambushes by mountain tribes. The crossing was a disaster by any conventional measure. But it worked, because Rome had never imagined anyone would try it. When Hannibal descended into northern Italy in autumn 218 BC, Rome was completely unprepared. The legions that were supposed to invade Spain and Africa were urgently recalled. The war had come to Italy itself.
What followed was the most devastating military sequence in Roman history. In less than 2 years, Hannibal destroyed 3 Roman armies in succession, each time using terrain, psychology, and tactical brilliance that Roman commanders simply couldn't counter. The first was the Battle of Trebia in December 218 BC. Hannibal lured a Roman army across a freezing river at dawn. His men fed and warmed, the Romans hungry and hypothermic. Then his hidden cavalry hit them from the flanks. 30,000 Romans were killed or captured. The second was Lake Trasimene in 217 BC. Hannibal positioned his entire army hidden in the hills above a narrow lakeside road, then waited for the Roman army to march into the trap. When the fog rolled in from the lake, he attacked from every direction simultaneously. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours. Another 15,000 were captured. The Roman commander, Flaminius, was killed personally in the fighting. It remains one of the greatest ambushes in military history. Rome responded by appointing a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus.
Fabius understood something crucial. Engaging Hannibal directly was suicide. Instead, he shadowed him, cut off foraging parties, harassed supply lines, and refused battle. This Fabian strategy was working. But Rome grew impatient. The Senate overruled Fabius and assembled its largest army in history, over 80,000 soldiers, to crush Hannibal once and for all. They marched to meet him near the village of Cannae in August 216 BC.
The Battle of Cannae is still studied in military academies around the world, not because Rome won, but because of what Hannibal did to them. Hannibal was outnumbered roughly 2 to 1. He had around 40,000 infantry against Rome's 80,000. By every conventional measure, this should have been the battle that ended his invasion. Instead, he turned Roman numbers into Roman weakness. Hannibal positioned his weakest troops, his Gauls and Spanish infantry, at the center of his line, deliberately forming a bulge forward toward the Roman formation. His best African veterans were positioned on the flanks. His devastating cavalry held the outer wings. When the battle began, the Romans did exactly what Hannibal expected. They pushed forward into the center, which deliberately gave ground, drawing the massive Roman formation inward, compressing it tighter and tighter. The Romans were so densely packed they could barely raise their swords. Then, the African veterans on the flanks wheeled inward. The cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, circled around and hit the Roman rear.
The Romans were completely encircled. In a single day, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died. Another 19,000 were captured. Among the dead were 80 senators, 2 former consuls, and a consul serving that year. It was the single worst day in Roman military history, a catastrophe so complete that a fifth of all Roman men of fighting age were gone by the time the sun set. The ancient sources describe the aftermath. The Carthaginian soldiers walked through the bodies collecting gold rings from the fingers of dead Roman aristocrats. Hannibal sent 3 bushels of gold rings back to Carthage as proof of victory. Rome's allies began switching sides. Capua, Italy's second largest city, defected to Carthage. Macedonia prepared to enter the war against Rome. Hannibal seemed on the verge of total victory.
Here is the question that has fascinated historians for 2,000 years. After Cannae, why didn't Hannibal march directly on Rome? His cavalry commander, Maharbal, reportedly said, "Hannibal, you know how to win a victory. You do not know how to use one." The answer is more complicated than it appears. Hannibal's strategy was never to destroy Rome militarily. It was to dismantle Rome's alliance system, to prove to Rome's Italian allies that Rome could not protect them and encourage them to defect. Without its allies providing troops and resources, Rome would collapse politically, not militarily. Rome, for the most part, didn't cooperate with this strategy. Despite Cannae, despite everything, the core of Rome's Italian allies remained loyal. The Senate banned public mourning, refused to ransom prisoners, and began recruiting new armies from anyone who could hold a sword, including slaves and criminals. Rome did not negotiate. Rome did not consider surrender.
Rome simply kept going. And while Hannibal won every battle in Italy, he was slowly losing the war everywhere else. In Spain, a young Roman general named Scipio was systematically dismantling Carthaginian power and cutting off Hannibal's reinforcements. Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, attempted to march reinforcements over the Alps in 27 BC, but was intercepted and killed at the Battle of the Metaurus before he could reach Hannibal. The Romans sent Hasdrubal's severed head rolling into Hannibal's camp. Hannibal had been in Italy for over a decade. He had won virtually every battle he fought, and he was losing the war.
Scipio Africanus was 31 years old when the Roman Senate gave him command of the invasion of Africa in 204 BC. Many thought it was reckless. Scipio had other ideas. He landed in North Africa and immediately began winning. Using tactics he had studied directly from Hannibal's own campaigns, flanking maneuvers, deception, audacity, Scipio destroyed one Carthaginian army after another. He allied with the Numidian king Massinissa, whose cavalry would prove decisive. Carthage panicked. After 15 years in Italy, Hannibal was recalled home to defend the city he had left as a young man. The two greatest generals of the ancient world met at Zama in October 202 BC. Hannibal had a numerical advantage in infantry and deployed 80 war elephants to break the Roman lines. Scipio had studied Cannae. He knew exactly how Hannibal fought, and he had prepared counters for everything.
He opened gaps in his lines to let the elephants pass through harmlessly. His superior Numidian cavalry destroyed the Carthaginian horsemen, and then, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae, swung around to attack the Carthaginian rear. Hannibal lost. For the first and only time in a pitched battle, Hannibal Barca was defeated. 20,000 Carthaginians died. Rome lost fewer than 2,000. The war was over. Carthage surrendered, ceded all territory outside Africa, gave up its fleet, and agreed to pay 10,000 silver talents over 50 years. An empire that had dominated the Western Mediterranean for centuries was reduced to a single city with no navy and no army.
Hannibal survived. He became a statesman and administrator, reforming Carthaginian finances so effectively that the city recovered rapidly. Too rapidly, as far as Rome was concerned. Forced out of Carthage by Roman political pressure, Hannibal spent his final years as a general for various Eastern kings. He was relentlessly pursued by Rome. In 183 BC, surrounded and facing capture, he took poison, reportedly saying, "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, who have thought it too heavy a task to wait for the death of a hated old man." He was 64 years old. But Rome wasn't finished with Carthage. For the next 3 decades, Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Roman Senate, regardless of topic, with the same words: Carthage must be destroyed.
In 149 BC, Rome found its pretext. Carthage had defended its territory against repeated raids by Rome's Numidian allies. Rome declared this a violation of the peace treaty and declared war. The Third Punic War was not a war. It was an execution. Rome besieged Carthage for 3 years. When the walls finally fell in 146 BC, Roman soldiers fought house to house for 7 days. The city was burned, its remaining population of around 50,000 people sold into slavery. The great library, the temples, the centuries of accumulated Carthaginian knowledge, all of it was destroyed. According to ancient sources, Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general who oversaw the destruction, stood watching the city burn and wept. When asked why, he said he was thinking of the fate of cities, and that one day the same destruction would come to Rome. He wasn't wrong.
Carthage is gone, so completely that for centuries scholars weren't entirely sure where it had stood. The language is dead. The literature is destroyed. We know Carthage almost entirely through the writings of the people who destroyed it, which means we will never know its full story. But what we do know is this. For a brief, extraordinary window in the 3rd century BC, Carthage came closer to destroying Rome than any civilization ever would. One general with a borrowed army
and no naval support, walked over the Alps in winter, won battle after battle for 15 years, and came within a single political decision of ending the Roman Republic before it became an empire. The world we live in, shaped by Roman law, Roman language, Roman architecture, Roman Christianity, exists in part because Rome made one decision Carthage never made. At Cannae, when everything was lost, Rome refused to surrender. Every civilization that ever challenged Rome eventually fell, but Carthage came the closest, and it paid the highest price. If this kind of deep dive is what you're here for, subscribe to Marcus the Archivist. Next week, we go inside the assassination that ended the Roman Republic itself.